Kinda frosty in here. It tastes like flavor of the month! Oh yeah, you know Frost Decay is turning some heads this patch, but is Frost Decay the melee king? Stay tuned because in today's video you'll get the talents, gear, essences, rotation, everything you need to get started on raiding and Mythic Plus as a Frost Death Knight. Before we dive in, keep in mind that the guide is coming out fairly early in the patch, before the meta starts to set in. Because of this, a decent amount of information has also been collected from the Accurus Discord channel, where all the DKs pooled their knowledge. Shout out to my dead but not really dead people. With that out of the way, the first talent row has Cold Heart as the option for both raiding and Mythic Plus. It's overall the best DPS option here and has a nice way of molding into your rotation that keeps things interesting. Second row we have options. By default I recommend you take Runic Attenuation. This whole row is about resource generation. The more haste you have, the better this option becomes, obviously. A very close contender is Horn of Winter. The reason I do not recommend this isn't because it's bad, it's actually seeming like 400 DPS more for me. It adds another button however and more control over when you want your resource generation. Adding a button isn't a bad thing, and I know you trolls complain already about the lack of spec complexity. However, Frost Decay has a few things to manage, especially when playing the Breath of Sindragosa build, which starts with you already pressing 2 cooldowns. Meaning Horn of Winter might be usable during Breath, which is a situation you need to be accustomed to since every GCD matters, if you want to get the most out of your breath at least. Play and practice Horn of Winter before deciding, and if you want to learn the spec one step at a time, take Runic Attenuation first. Third row is the utility row, and as far as utility goes, pick whatever you like as long as you can take advantage of it. You should start with Asphyxiate since it's reliable, works on ads, gives you another interrupt in dungeons and such. Fourth row brings you 2 options again. For single target and raiding in general, take Frozen Pulse. The tooltip describes this as an AoE talent and they all are on this row. However, this one gives you the most single target damage. For AoE and dungeons, take Frost Scythe. On 2 or more targets, this baby will replace Obliterate in your rotation. However, I have my reservations about how good it is during Breath of Sindragosa, since I feel it never generates enough runic power for how much you actually spam it. Level 75 talent row is another utility row, and the argument before stands. Usually you should take Wraith Walk since you have no mobility when you have to move from one target to another. Permafrost is another option if you don't have to move at all. Keep in mind that uptime on your target is crucial for Frost. Level 90 row, take Frostworm's Fury. This is the best choice on the row and a really fun ability to use properly. On paper it might not show much for a 3-minute cooldown, however the way you want to use it is by snapshotting it. Kind of, when you're at your most attack power / strength, and the damage will scale like crazy, especially in AoE situations. The other option is Gathering Storm, and it's what you want to get if you have 3 Frozen Tempest Azurite traits, which we will discuss later in the video. Once you have these 3, it will do competitive or more damage than Frostworm's Fury. Last row is basically the build defining row. The guides we do focus on one main build as long as it's viable and optimal in all scenarios. That build is Breath of Sindragosa, which is the talent you pick. Breath of Sindragosa alters your rotation and the way you think about your resource once it is up, and we will discuss this later on. This talent received a lot of changes in 8.2. We also received a comment from one of you stating that the runic power consumed by Breath does not proc runic empowerment, which is what I thought initially. However, I did repeated tests and I'm getting back a lot of runes during its window, enough that I can definitely tell it's not a fluke. Either it's intentional and Blizz didn't mention it, or they forgot to take it out of the game. As it stands, runic empowerment works during Breath. The other option is Ice Cap, which changes your build and most likely your gear as well. If there's enough demand for it, we can make a separate video for Ice Cap and what it implies. When you plan on gearing up any DPS spec and you plan on doing it right, you'll have to simulate the strength of each stat, because this is just how the game is now, and there is no way to tell for sure what stats will be best at all times, especially with benthic gear. Fortunately, Frost Death Knights do not have a strict stat priority, since most of the secondary stats are fairly close to each other. As an example, this is a sim for my stat weights, and as you can tell, they are fairly close to each other. Weapon DPS will always be better, meaning when it comes to your weapons, the highest eye level is preferred regardless of what stats it has. And even though strength is at the bottom, the simple fact that all of the stats are so close to each other, eye level will be the best way to go, which means higher strength values as well. The only thing you can choose if you have the luxury would be mastery and critical strike. If you don't plan on simming your character, then just try to keep mastery and critical strike as high as you can. Usually crit will be better because it works off of your passives and some Azurite traits. Since I have around 1.2k crit and only 800 mastery, the sim is telling me to get more of the latter, so again, your character might be different. Once again, this guide is coming out before the mythic raid has even released, so things might change and update. The best way to keep track of stuff like trinkets and Azurite traits and which ones to get is to go on websites like herodamage.com, where you will see graphs of simulated expected DPS out of individual items. Trinkets, for example, you actually have one that seems to outperform all others, and that is Azura's Font of Power, that drops from Azura herself. The reason this is good is pretty clear: passive crit plus an active that gives you a ton of strength. Two other trinkets you should try to get as much as you are able to are the Gore Crusted Butcher's Block from Waycrest Manor, again a crit trinket, and the Gladiator's Badge that gives you a strength active. For Season 2 it was named Sinister's Gladiator Badge. Most likely you will have a Season 3 equivalent, because we all know Blizzard is not that creative, right? Unless they are, and everything was a lie until now. Just keep in mind that if you go too much into crit, you'll have to value mastery more, which is why as a default mastery is above crit, simply because you get naturally better crit trinkets. You can get more details and more in-depth talks once you check our stream on twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline, where I test specs and different things while talking to all the friendly Frost DKs in the chat. Join and tell me how you are topping the meters in your group. When it comes to Azurite traits, not much changed in Season 3, at least for now. The buffs Frost received have been for spells and talents, and the main build remained the same, so the traits are pretty much the same as well, with the exception of Treacherous Covenant, since this one doesn't drop in the new raid, and if you want this, you'll have to do the old raid that clearly has a much inferior eye level loot table. As such, you should aim to stack 2 traits depending on the pieces you get. Frozen Tempest has been one of the most popular traits, mainly because the majority of the raid encounters had more than one target, although do not dismiss this trait even in single target, especially if you have it stacked 3 times. You also need to run Gathering Storm with this, as mentioned in the talents, for maximum synergy. This goes without saying that the trait is even better in Mythic Plus. The other trait is Icy Citadel, which is one I personally recommend. This baby simply buffs you with insane levels of strength after your Pillar of Frost window ends, so it benefits both single target and AoE. It also alters your rotation just a bit, but more on this later. Following the logic mentioned before, you get this with Frostworm's Fury in tandem. Other slots can be filled with traits like Echoing Howl and Frostwolf's Indignation, which are both AoE oriented traits and should be used at your discretion. And the final advice you should heed is sim your traits. You'll struggle a bit before getting the exact Azurite pieces with the exact traits, and until then you'll have to do with what you have. You can either pick them following the rules I mentioned, or sim if you really want to push those damage meters. Moving on to the essences. Now, depending on when you are watching the video, you might not have all the slots available, especially at the beginning of the raid, so the best combination of essences is still up for grabs. As an example, the most you can do is follow the sims and theory crafting done by the community and websites like herodamage.com, which was mentioned earlier. The undisputed top 3 essences will be Condensed Life Force, the Crucible of Flame, and Blood of the Enemy, assuming the rank 2 of each will be predominant at the beginning, so you can choose Blood of the Enemy or Crucible of Flame as your main one, since they are more accessible and easy to level up, with the one side note that Blood of the Enemy is a PvP related essence, meaning you'll need to do PvP to get it to rank it up. This is up to you, but thankfully you won't have to struggle too much since Condensed Life Force will be obtainable from the raid. As for your first minor essence, you should aim for Memory of Lucid Dreams, especially if you play Breath of Sindragosa. Getting rank 2 for this one is arguably the easiest out of all and can even work as a main essence for lack of a better option. The resource refunds and generation works well into breath windows. The rank 1 of Memory of Lucid Dreams has more DPS output than almost all other options, so it should be something to consider as you are starting out. Remember that you can switch from and to any combination of essences you have as you level up your necklace, so don't be afraid to test them out and see which ones meshes the best with your playstyle. All of the graphs you just saw are just maths, and we all know that maths sometimes cannot be trusted. And other times it ruins lives, which is why we play video games instead. To make it easier getting in the rotation, I will break it down so you can take it in more easily. First, let's talk about Pillar of Frost. The cooldown on this major cooldown is 45 seconds, and it will add a few conditions to your rotation. Each rune you spend during its duration will increase the strength buff you get, and this is important because of a few things. You'll have Chains of Ice from Cold Hard that will stack and reach max stacks almost at the same time as your Pillar of Frost reaches its end, as long as you use both of them on cooldown. You want to use Chains of Ice at 20 stacks just as Pillar of Frost is about to drop off, so you can cram all that strength into one big hit. The exact same argument applies to Frostworm's Fury, which is admittedly on a longer cooldown, but you want to use it at your highest amount of strength. Any ability that does instant damage and scales off of your strength will be used this way. This does not apply to the Crucible of Flame essence since it scales with versatility, meaning you want to use Crucible paired with a versatility buff, if you have any, and if not, then just use it on cooldown. With that being said, we have the Icy Citadel Azurite trait. Once you have it stacked 3 times, the amount of strength you get is even greater, meaning you want to use all of the above mentioned after Pillar of Frost drops, since that's when the Icy Citadel buff starts. All of these arguments have the purpose of making you understand how to take advantage of the many instants you have that can either hit really hard or like a wet noodle. Now let's take a look at the priority system. The priority system is basically the order of your most important button to the least based on which one is available to press and what conditions you need to meet. Not the actual order you press the buttons in, there's a difference. Number 1 is Chains of Ice, following the rules mentioned before. Next, Frostworm's Fury, same logic, if you picked the talent of course. Remorseless Winter only if you have the talent and Azurite traits. Howling Blast to consume the Rime proc. Obliterate once you have 4 or more runes available. Frost Strike to prevent capping on runic power. Obliterate to consume Killing Machine procs. Frost Strike again if you have more than 70 runic power and nothing better to press. Obliterate to generate runic power. And Frost Strike as a filler. For AoE, the priority is the same with the exception of Frost Scythe replacing Obliterate. Another mention in AoE are your cooldowns. You'll have to judge it for yourself if it's worth popping Pillar of Frost and the associated follow-up spells. This is the general priority system, but you still need to understand the Breath of Sindragosa window, which will also be your opener. As your opener, the rotation is easy, but when you are mid-fight, you won't have the same runes and runic power and conditions available, as well as cooldowns, so make sure to adapt. As a rule of thumb, before popping Breath, you want to be as close to capped on runic power and with at least 3 runes on cooldown. To achieve these conditions on your opener, you will start by obliterating 3 times and consuming any rhyme procs with Howling Blast as they proc. Once 1 or 2 runes have already come back off cooldown, pop Empower Rune Weapon, Pillar of Frost with whatever trinket you have, and then Breath of Sindragosa, which will move you into the Breath window. In the Breath window, cast Obliterate whenever you are reaching less than 30 runic power. Use Remorseless Winter if you have the traits and the talents. Howling Blast only to consume rhyme procs or if Frost Fever is about to drop. Obliterate to prevent capping on runes. Remorseless Winter regardless of traits and talents here. And again Obliterate as a filler. For AoE and dungeons build with Frost Scythe, Breath is not as efficient if you actually use Frost Scythe as opposed to Obliterate. The runes generate at a much faster pace than you can consume them, and you will end up with no runic power, no breath, and runes to spare. So I recommend you use Obliterate even if you are fighting multiple targets to maintain a longer Breath of Sindragosa. As for essences, of course it matters which ones you use to place them during your rotation. Crucible of Flame can and should be used the same way as 20 stacks of Chains of Ice, with versatility instead of strength. While Memory of Lucid Dreams should be used during your breath windows, same as Blood of the Enemy. Your haste and rank will play a role here, but if you think of your major essence as another major cooldown, you'll be able to make the proper judgment as to when to use it, so good luck! To get the proper enchants, gems and such, you need to keep in mind the stat priority you have. It will come down to crit and mastery, so choose the ones that give you a balance between the two. To start off, a Chord of Mastery will be your ring enchant and Masterful Sea Courant your go-to gem. As for weapon enchants, hello DK Life! Get your very own Rune of Razor Ice on your main hand and Fallen Crusader on your offhand, rejoicing in the fact that they are free. Greater Flask of the Undertow and Superior Battle Potion of Strength will be your go-to alchemical options, while the Feast or the highest mastery food will be your ideal diet. If you have too much mastery, simply swap the consumables with their crit equivalent, but the best way will always be to sim and see which stat is strongest. 8.2 has just started, and we have a lot more class guides for you in the next couple of months. And in the meantime, if Frost isn't up your alley, check our Arms Warrior first impression for 8.2 with all the changes it had. Shout out to our Patreons. Love and support your dedication to our content, guys. And if you want to check our Patreon program and get all the goodies and shit, check the details down in the description. Gear up with MarcelianOnline merch by clicking our official Teespring down below. We have t-shirts, tank tops, hoodies and mugs, all branded with that Warcraft love everybody needs. Thanks for watching the video and have an amazing day.